And we are going to study the second key rebellion against the Soviet Union. We've already studied the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. 12 years later, the Czechoslovak people will attempt the same thing, but they will have learnt their lessons from the events of the Hungarian Revolution, and these events will become known as the Prague Spring of 1968. So the first thing we're going to do is recap on prior learning. I'm going to give you 10 scrambled words. You need to be able to unscramble them and understand their significance and their timings. So here are the 10. They now need to be unscrambled. When we go through these and correct them, please make sure that you amend in green pen. Novikov then was the telegram sent by the Soviet ambassador in the United States explaining to Stalin what he thought the Americans were up to. And he accuses the Americans of being power mad and hell-bent on world domination. Domino theory, the American belief that communism would spread if it was not contained. One country falling to communism would knock the next down. That led to the Truman Doctrine of containment. The Warsaw Pact, the military alliance of 1955, to organize the defense of Eastern Europe against the threat of NATO in the West. Potsdam was the last of the Great War conferences. Stalin attended, but Truman and Attlee were new. This was a meeting where the three did not get on well. Fidel Castro was the leader of the 1959 revolution in Cuba, who failed to get along with the Americans and turned to the Soviets for help and friendship, which in turn led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Truman Doctrine, President Truman's decision, his policy to contain communism. The Berlin Crisis, well, West Berlin was a center of a series of crises throughout the Cold War. We have the blockade of 1948, but then we have the Second Berlin Crisis from 1958 onwards, whereby thousands of East Germans were leaving East Germany through West Berlin, which would result eventually in the wall being built. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader that takes over from Stalin. The Vienna Summit was the meeting in 1960 between Khrushchev and the very young American President Kennedy, and Kennedy fails to impress Khrushchev, so Khrushchev believes he can outmaneuver and get his own way. And finally, the Bay of Pigs. America and President Kennedy's attempt to overthrow Castro in 1960, which failed and further drove Castro into the arms of the Soviets. So, today then, Czechoslovakia and the Prague Spring. We've already said that there was a revolution, an attempted rebellion against the Soviets in 1956 in Hungary, and the reasons behind the Czechoslovak uprising in 1968 are remarkably similar. But let's make it a little bit more specific here to Czechoslovakia. Since 1957, Czechoslovakia is run by a very strict dictatorship under the leadership of a guy called Novotny. He runs a country which borders the Soviet Union, so strategically it's very important to the Soviet Union to control what goes on in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia has a lot of industry, a lot of engineering and machine-making factories. What Czechoslovakia produces is important. The Soviet Union can't afford to lose Czechoslovakia. But unfortunately, the Czechoslovak economy, like all the other Eastern European economies, simply does not perform. It does not deliver the prosperity and the wealth that the economies in Western Europe are doing. And the Czech people here, like all the other Eastern Europeans, can see over that Iron Curtain, can listen to the radio over that Iron Curtain, and they know that things are not as good in the East as they are in the West. Please remember, no one asked the Czechs if they wanted communism or if they wanted to be dominated by the Soviet Union. These people were poor, they were jealous, they were unhappy, and they wanted communism at the very least to change and reform, and at the very best they wanted to get rid of it altogether. In 1964, a new leader comes to power in the Soviet Union, a guy called Brezhnev, Leonid Brezhnev. He actually leads a movement to get Khrushchev removed. There is also new leadership in the United States. President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and his vice president, President Johnson, takes over. There's also new leadership in China. In 1968, the Czechs bring a new leader into control. His name is Alexander Dubcek, and Alexander Dubcek, although a communist, is a believer that communism has to reform. Now, this makes him very rare. The people in power were the very ones least inclined to want to change things. Ordinary people might not have been doing particularly well, but the leadership in these countries were doing well. Dubcek says that communism has to change, it has to reform. And he will start leading that process. But unlike the Hungarians in 1956 under Imre Nagy, Dubcek wishes to do this completely publicly and completely transparently. He has to run everything past Moscow, past Brezhnev. Now, Brezhnev, he is more than aware that communism isn't working as well as it should do, and therefore he is prepared to allow the Czechs to carry out their reforms, but he will watch them like a hawk to make sure that the changes to communism do not go too fast or too far. So there's a brief timeline of the events that we're going to look at. Dubcek becomes leader. In a matter of months, he starts his reforms, which become known as the Prague Spring. But by August of that year, the Soviets end the reforms. They invade Czechoslovakia. A month later, Brezhnev, like American presidents before him, he announces his Brezhnev Doctrine, which is essentially the Truman Doctrine in reverse. In April 1969, Dubcek is sacked. So, what do we know about Czechoslovakia so far? Well, it's in Eastern Europe, and Stalin wanted to control Eastern Europe to protect the Soviet Union. So he installs a communist government, therefore providing the Soviet Union with the protection it needs. But then, like in every other Eastern European country, we have all the problems that then happen. The communists are unpopular. The Eastern Europeans don't want to be ruled by the Soviet Union. They want democracy. They aren't as wealthy. They aren't as happy, but they are very educated. So consequently, we have a dangerous combination of people who are poor, jealous, and know that they could do better. What were some of the specific problems that they were complaining against? They didn't like Soviet rule. They didn't like the secret police limiting their freedoms. They believed their economy was run for the benefit of the Soviet Union and not their own people. There wasn't anything to buy in the shops. They knew that Western shops were full of consumer goods like washing machines and TVs. Not in theirs. There was no freedom of speech, censorship. Ministers who they liked were sacked, a low standard of living, and there were increasing tensions and protests and riots. If you watch this clip, one of the most famous protesters against communism was Jan Palach, and he self-immolated himself in the middle of Wenceslas Square in Prague in 1969. He set fire to himself. Dubcek wants to bring about changes. He wants to create socialism, communism, with a human face. The most important thing to me is communism is the right way forward. I do, however, believe it should not make the people miserable. They should be able to enjoy life, express their views, and challenge the government without fear of being punished by the government. We need to offer socialism with a human face. He was very brave. He was doing and saying what everyone in leadership in the communist world knew needed to be done, but none were brave enough to do it. Therefore, he carries out his reforms. At each stage, these are all approved by Brezhnev in Moscow. Censorship is relaxed. The unions are given power. More power given to regional government. Trade with the West increased. Czech people were allowed to travel abroad. And even the plans for multi-party elections, like we have in our country. So convinced was Dubcek that given the choice, people would still vote communist. Brezhnev's problem is that Dubcek still went too far, too fast. He was also pestered by leaders in other communist countries to stop what the Czechs were doing. If the Czechs were allowed to reform and Brezhnev lost control, other countries in Eastern Europe said the people would ask for the same things. Brezhnev was urged to intervene. August the 20th, 1968, Brezhnev orders, along with other Eastern European countries, the occupation and invasion of Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovak people were sensible enough not to resist, and the rebellions and reforms were crushed. Dubcek was ordered to reverse his reforms, he was placed under arrest, and Czechoslovakia was put under control. Brezhnev then justified why he was doing what he was doing, and he famously announced his Brezhnev doctrine. My actions may have appeared an aggressive attempt to dominate another European country, but I prefer to look at it as necessary to protect communism in Europe. The actions of any individual communist country affected all communist countries, so if one country's actions threaten the Eastern Bloc and the Warsaw Pact, then it is the duty of those other countries to take steps to stop them. That is why we went into Czechoslovakia. The Brezhnev doctrine was the Truman doctrine in reverse. So basically now, some very quick information again to recap. Hardline communist Novotny was destroying the Czechoslovak economy. Czechoslovakia was important to the Soviet Union. Leadership changes around the world led to the Czechs believing that they could start to change their own country. They elect Alexander Dubcek to do this. Dubcek was a good communist, but he believed communism had to change. These are his proposals. These are the reforms that he brings about. You now need to tell me the causes of the Prague Spring and the consequences of the Prague Spring based upon the information that you have been given in this presentation by completing that worksheet. Here are the statements that you can move in to the causes and consequences. You can copy them over or do simplified versions. What is the most important cause of the Prague Spring? What was the most important consequence? You can then go to the PowerPoint for the exam practice.